surveillance and reconnaissance assets so that we've got a better picture of what's taking place inside of Iraq.
Ladies and gentlemen, right now here on SHR Media, this is President Barack Obama speaking in Washington about the incident in Iraq with ISIS. We'll take you to him live now via C-SPAN.
Third, the United States will continue to increase our support to Iraqi security forces. We're prepared to create joint operations centers in Baghdad and northern Iraq to share intelligence and coordinate planning to confront the terrorist threat of ISIL. Through our new Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, we're prepared to work with Congress to provide additional equipment. We have had advisors in Iraq through our embassy, and we're prepared to send a small number of additional American military advisors, up to 300, to assess how we can best train, advise, and support Iraqi security forces going forward. American forces will not be returning to combat in Iraq, but we will help Iraqis as they take the fight to terrorists who threaten the Iraqi people, the region, and American interests as well. Fourth, in recent days, we've positioned additional U.S. military assets in the region. Because of our increased intelligence resources, we're developing more information about potential targets associated with ISIL. And going forward, we will be prepared to take targeted and precise military action if and when we determine that the situation on the ground requires it. If we do, I will consult closely with Congress and leaders in Iraq and in the region. I want to emphasize, though, that the best and most effective response to a threat like ISIL will ultimately involve partnerships where local forces, like Iraqis, take the lead. Finally, the United States will lead a diplomatic effort to work with Iraqi leaders and the countries in the region to support stability in Iraq. At my direction, Secretary Kerry will depart this weekend for meetings in the Middle East and Europe, where he'll be able to consult with our allies and partners. And just as all Iraqis' neighbors must respect Iraq's territorial integrity, all of Iraq's neighbors have a vital interest in ensuring that Iraq does not descend into civil war or become a safe haven for terrorists. Above all, Iraqi leaders must rise above their differences and come together around a political plan for Iraq's future. Shia, Sunni, Kurds, all Iraqis must have confidence that they can advance their interests and aspirations through the political process rather than through violence. National unity meetings have to go forward to build consensus across Iraq's different communities. Now that the results of Iraq's recent election has been certified, a new parliament should convene as soon as possible. The formation of a new government will be an opportunity to begin a genuine dialogue and forge a government that represents the legitimate interests of all Iraqis. Now, it's not the place for the United States to choose Iraq's leaders. It is clear, though, that only leaders that can govern with an inclusive agenda are going to be able to truly bring the Iraqi people together and help them through this crisis. Meanwhile, the United States will not pursue military options that support one sect inside of Iraq at the expense of another. There's no military solution inside of Iraq, certainly not one that is led by the United States. But there is an urgent need for an inclusive political process, a more capable Iraqi security force, and counterterrorism efforts that deny groups like ISIL a safe haven. In closing, recent days have reminded us of the deep scars left by America's war in Iraq. Alongside the loss of nearly 4,500 American patriots, many veterans carry the wounds of that war and will for the rest of their lives. Here at home, Iraq sparked vigorous debates and intense emotions in the past, and we've seen some of those debates resurface. But what's clear from the last decade is the need for the United States to ask hard questions before we take action abroad, particularly military action. The most important question we should all be asking, the issue that we have to keep front and center, the issue that I keep front and center, is what is in the national security interests of the United States of America. As Commander-in-Chief, that's what I stay focused on. As Americans, that's what all of us should be focused on. And going forward, we will continue to consult closely with Congress. We will keep the American people informed. We will remain vigilant, and we will continue to do everything in our power to protect the security of the United States and the safety of the American people. So with that, I'm going to take a couple of questions. I'll start with Colleen McCain Nelson of the Wall Street Journal.
Mr. President, do you have any confidence in Prime Minister Maliki at this point, and can Maliki bring political stability to Iraq?
As I said, it's not our job to choose Iraq's leaders. Part of what our patriots fought for during many years in Iraq was the right and the opportunity for Iraqis to determine their own destiny and choose their own leaders. But I don't think there's any secret that right now, at least, there is deep divisions between Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish leaders. And as long as those deep divisions continue or worsen, it's going to be very hard for an Iraqi central government to direct an Iraqi military to deal with these threats. And so we've consulted with Prime Minister Maliki, and we've said that to him privately. We've said it publicly, that whether he is Prime Minister or any other leader aspires to lead the country, that it has to be an agenda in which Sunni, Shia, and Kurd all feel that they have the opportunity to advance their interests through the political process. And we've seen over the last 2 years, actually dating back to 2008, 2009, but I think worse over the last 2 years, the sense among Sunnis that their interests were not being served, that legislation that had been promised around, for example, de-Ba'athification had been stalled. I think that you hear similar complaints that the government in Baghdad has not sufficiently reached out to some of the tribes and been able to bring them in to a process that gives them a sense of being part of a unity government or a single nation state, and that has to be worked through. Part of the reason why we saw better equipped Iraqi security forces with larger numbers not be able to hold contested territory against ISIL probably reflects that lack of a sense of commitment on the part of Sunni communities to work with Baghdad, and that has to be fixed if we're going to get through this crisis. Jim Acosta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Americans may look at this decision that you're making today as a sneak preview of coming attractions, that the number of advisors that you're planning to send in may just be the beginning of a boots-on-the-ground scenario down the road. Why is Iraq's civil war in the national security interests of the United States, and are you concerned about the potential for mission creep?
I think we always have to guard against mission creep. So let me repeat what I've said in the past. American combat troops are not going to be fighting in Iraq again. We do not have the ability to simply solve this problem by sending in tens of thousands of troops and committing the kinds of blood and treasure that has already been expended in Iraq. Ultimately, this is something that is going to have to be solved by the Iraqis. It is in our national security interests not to see an all-out civil war inside of Iraq. Not just for humanitarian reasons, but because that ultimately can be destabilizing throughout the region, and in addition to having strong allies there that we are committed to protecting, obviously issues like energy and global energy markets continues to be important. We also have an interest in making sure that we don't have a safe haven that continues to grow for ISIL and other extremist jihadist groups who could use that as a base of operations for planning and targeting ourselves, our personnel overseas, and eventually the homeland. And if they accumulate more money, they accumulate more ammunition, more military capability, larger numbers. That poses great dangers not just to allies of ours like Jordan, which is very close by, but it also poses a great danger potentially to Europe and ultimately the United States. We have already seen inside of Syria or groups like ISIL that right now are fighting with other extremist groups, or an Assad regime that was non-responsive to Sunni majority there, that has attracted more and more jihadists or would-be jihadists, some of them from Europe. They then start traveling back to Europe, and that over time can create a cadre of terrorists that could harm us. So we have humanitarian interests in preventing bloodshed. We have strategic interests in stability in the region. We have counterterrorism interests. All those have to be addressed. The initial effort for us to get situational awareness through the reconnaissance and surveillance that we've already done, coupled with some of our best people on the ground doing assessments of exactly what the situation is, starting, by the way, with the perimeter around Baghdad and making sure that that's not overrun. That's a good investment for us to make, but that does not foreshadow a larger commitment of troops to actually fight in Iraq. That would not be effective in meeting the core interests that we have.
Just very quickly, do you wish you had left a residual force in Iraq? Any regrets about that decision in 2011?
Well, keep in mind, that wasn't a decision made by me. That was a decision made by the Iraqi government. We offered a modest residual force to help continue to train and advise Iraqi security forces. We had a core requirement, which we require in any situation where we have U.S. troops overseas, and that is that they are provided immunity since they are being invited by the sovereign government there, so that if, for example, they end up acting in self-defense, if they are attacked and find themselves in a tough situation, that they're not somehow hauled before a foreign court. That's a core requirement that we have for U.S. troop presence anywhere. The Iraqi government and Prime Minister Maliki declined to provide us that immunity. And so I think it is important, though, to recognize that despite that decision, that we have continued to provide them with very intensive advice and support, and have continued throughout this process over the last 5 years to not only offer them our assistance militarily, but we've also continued to urge the kinds of political compromises that we think are ultimately necessary in order for them to have a functioning multi-sectarian democracy inside the country. Juliet Alpert. There you go.
You just mentioned Syria a moment ago. The United States has been slow to provide significant weapons and training directly to the Syrian opposition. Does the expansion of the Syria war into Iraq change your mind about the type of weapons and training you're now willing to give the opposition there? Is that what prompted Secretary Kerry to say of Syria, we are augmenting our assistance in significant ways, and can you elaborate on what you are doing now that you weren't doing before?
That assessment about the dangers of what was happening in Syria have existed since the very beginning of the Syrian civil war. The question has never been whether we thought this was a serious problem. The question has always been, is there the capacity of moderate opposition on the ground to absorb and counteract extremists that it might have been pouring in, as well as an Assad regime supported by Iran and Russia that outmanned them and was ruthless. And so we have consistently provided that opposition with support. Oftentimes the challenge is if you have former farmers or teachers or pharmacists who now are taking up opposition against a battle-hardened regime with support from external actors that have a lot at stake, how quickly can you get them trained? How effective are you able to mobilize them? And that continues to be a challenge. And even before the situation that we saw with ISIL going into Iraq, we had already tried to maximize what we can do to support moderate opposition that not only can counteract the brutality of Assad, but also can make sure that in the minds of Sunnis, they don't think that their only alternative is either Mr. Assad or extremist groups like ISIL or al-Nusra.
What you might be doing differently, as the Secretary of State alluded to?
Well, I think that the key to both Syria and Iraq is going to be a combination of what happens inside the country, working with moderate Syrian opposition, working with an Iraqi government that is inclusive, and us laying down a more effective counterterrorism platform that gets all the countries in the region pulling in the same direction. And I alluded to this in the West Point speech. This is I talked about it today with respect to the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund. There's going to be a long-term problem in this region in which we have to build and partner with countries that are committed to our interests, our values, and at the same time, we have immediate problems with terrorist organizations that may be advancing. And rather than try to play whack-a-mole wherever these terrorist organizations may pop up, what we have to do is to be able to build effective partnerships, make sure that they have capacity. Some of the assets that have been devoted solely to Afghanistan over the last decade, we've got to shift to make sure that we have coverage in the Middle East and North Africa. You look at a country like Yemen, a very impoverished country, and one that has its own sectarian or ethnic divisions. We do have a committed partner in President Hadi and his government, and we have been able to help to develop their capacities without putting large numbers of U.S. troops on the ground. At the same time as we've got enough CT or counterterrorism capabilities that we're able to go after folks that might try to hit our embassy or might be trying to export terrorism into Europe or the United States. And looking at how we can create more of those models is going to be part of the solution in dealing with both Syria and Iraq. But in order for us to do that, we still need to have actual governments on the ground that we can partner with, and that we've got some confidence are going to pursue the political policies of inclusiveness. In Yemen, for example, a wide-ranging national dialogue that took a long time, but helped to give people a sense that there is a legitimate political outlet for grievances that they may have. Peter Mayer.
Thank you, sir. Going back to where you see Prime Minister al-Maliki playing a role at this point, you said that it's a time to rise above differences, that there's a need for a more inclusive government. Is he a unifier, and how much clout does the United States ultimately have with any of the leadership in Iraq at this point, really?
Well, we still provide them significant assistance. I think they recognize that unlike some other players in the region, we don't have territorial ambitions in their country. We're not looking to control their assets or their energy. We want to make sure that we're vindicating the enormous effort and sacrifice that was made by our troops, in giving them an opportunity to build a stable, inclusive society that can prosper and deliver for the basic needs and aspirations of the Iraqi people. And at the same time, they are a sovereign country. They have their own politics. And what we have tried to do is to give them our best advice about how they can solve their political problems. Now that they are in crisis, we are indicating to them that there's not going to be a simple military solution to this issue. If you start seeing the various groups inside of Iraq simply go to their respective corners, then it is almost certain that Baghdad and the central government will not be able to control huge chunks of their own country. The only way they can do that is if there are credible Sunni leaders, both at the national level and at the local level, who have confidence that a Shia majority, that the Kurds, that all those folks are committed to a fair and just governance of the country. Right now, that doesn't exist. There's too much suspicion. There's too much mistrust. And the good news is that an election took place in which, despite all this mistrust, despite all this frustration, despite all this anger, you still had millions of Iraqis turn out, in some cases in very dangerous circumstances. You now have a court that has certified those elections, and you have a constitutional process to advance government formation. So far, at least, the one bit of encouraging news that we've seen inside of Iraq is that all the parties have said they continue to be committed to choosing a leadership and a government through the existing constitutional order. So what you're seeing, I think, is as the prospects of civil war heighten, many Iraqi leaders stepping back and saying, let's not plunge back into the abyss. Let's see if we can resolve this politically. But they don't have a lot of time. And you have a group like ISIL that is doing everything that it can to descend the country back into chaos. And so one of the messages that we had for Prime Minister Maliki, but also for the Speaker of the House and the other leadership inside of Iraq is get going on this government formation. It'll make it a lot easier for them to shape a military strategy. It'll also make it possible for us to partner much more effectively than we can currently.
Given the Prime Minister's track record, is he a unifier? Can he play that role when, after what we've seen play out over the last couple of weeks, is brought into play?
I think the test is before him and other Iraqi leaders as we speak. Right now, they can make a series of decisions. Regardless of what's happened in the past, right now is a moment where the fate of Iraq hangs in the balance. And the test for all of them is going to be whether they can overcome the mistrust, the deep sectarian divisions, in some cases just political opportunism, and say this is bigger than any one of us, and we've got to make sure that we do what's right for the Iraqi people. And that's a challenge. That's not something that the United States can do for them. That's not something, by the way, that the United States armed forces can do for them. We can provide them the space. We can provide them the tools. But ultimately, they're going to have to make those decisions. In the meantime, my job is to make sure that American personnel there are safe, that we are consulting with the Iraqi security forces, that we're getting a better assessment of what's on the ground, and that we're recognizing the dangers of ISIL over the long term and developing the kinds of comprehensive counterterrorism strategies that we're going to need to deal with this issue. And that's going to involve some short-term responses to make sure that ISIL is not obtaining capacity to endanger us directly or our allies and partners. But it also is going to require some long-term strategies as well, because part of what we've seen with respect to ISIL is a broader trend that I talked about at West Point, rather than a single network, a discrete network of terrorists. This fluid combination of hardened terrorists, disaffected local leadership, and where there's vacuums, they're filling it and creating the potential for serious danger for all concerned. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Any words on what you were willing to do and
With
how
respect,
you were willing to work with them?
our view is that Iran can play a constructive role if it is helping to send the same message to the Iraqi government that we're sending, which is that Iraqi only holds together if it's inclusive, and that if the interests of Sunni, Shia, and Kurd are all respected. If Iran is coming in solely as an armed force on behalf of the Shia, and if it is framed in that fashion, then that probably worsens the situation and the prospect for government formation that would actually be constructive over the long term.
What's your sense of that right now?
Well, I think that just as Iraq's leaders have to make decisions, I think Iran has heard from us. We've indicated to them that it is important for them to avoid steps that might encourage the kind of sectarian splits that might lead to civil war. And the one thing that I think is has to be emphasized. We have deep differences with Iran across the board on a whole host of issues. Obviously, what's happened in Syria, in part, is the result of Iran coming in hot and heavy on one side. Iran obviously should consider the fact that if its view of the region is solely through sectarian frames, they could find themselves fighting in a whole lot of places, and that's probably not good for the Iranian economy or the Iranian people over the long term either. I suspect there are folks in Iran who recognize that. A Iraq in chaos on their borders is probably not in their interests, but old habits die hard, and we'll have to see whether they can take what I think would be a more promising path over the next several days. All right? Thank you very much, everybody.
And you were listening to President Obama speak about the escalating violence in Iraq here on the SHR Media Network. With us on the line right now is our friend from Pundit Press, Dan Butcher. Dan, are you there? Dan, do I still have you? Oh, Dan,
Sean,
I'm sorry. Are you there?
can you
Dan?
hear?
There you are, sir.
Hey, here I am.
We knew you'd be there somewhere. It's just a matter of where. I had to figure out where I hid you.
Well, you found me, so I'm here. And it was probably nice of the president to show up for his press conference over an hour late.
Can you imagine if I had a meeting with the president and I kept telling him, nah, I'm going to be an hour late, an hour late, an hour late. 15 more minutes, Mr. President. Yeah. It's so funny, too, because I understand that he's got a lot going on, and I never want to assume, even with this president, that it's just out of anything but more of necessity, if you will. But here he is giving a 30-minute speech that was supposed to start an hour ago, and it's so funny to listen to some of the contrast to things that he has said in the past. on the Iraq situation, and specifically with Iran. And I want to get to that in a minute, but I want to go down the list of pretty much things that he talked about, Dan, and get your feedback on it. First of all, no boots on the ground is what he is saying now. He said that before too. Do you think that if we talked about it on our show last night, and we pretty much came to the conclusion of is we pretty much should do nothing and let them figure it out. And that's probably the only way that it'll get solved. They've been having this fight for hundreds of years, and there's nothing we're going to be able to do in the next 4 months to change that. Do you think if he is choosing to meddle and kind of interject us into a advisory role and a democratic role, and then he opened it up for possibility of, sounds like, airstrikes perhaps or drone strikes if needed, do you think that avoids boots on the ground, or does that almost draw us into the point that it may bring us back to boots on the ground?
Well, I don't think with this president that you're going to ever see boots on the ground in a combat role like that in Iraq again. He's and you have to remember with this president, everything that he does is a political calculation, and so in all honesty, for him to put boots on the ground in Iraq would be for him to admit that President Bush was right and that he is wrong, and stop and think about how bad that would play with the Democrat base, especially the folks out there that are very anti-war or anti-military, etc. That would not play very well with them, and especially in an election year when the Senate is coming into play, the Republicans are looking at making some significant gains as far as seats in the House, and then of course leading into the 2016 presidential election. We saw what this president did when it looked like his own re-election bid might be in jeopardy because of the Benghazi terror attack and the cover-up and the nonsense that's taking place by that. So you're not going to see him react like that. And also, from the questioning and from the reaction, you continue to see with this president, he does not want the United States to assume a leadership role whatsoever on anything in the world today, and certainly involving the Middle East and involving Iraq in particular. It's just that's just something. His foreign policy or lack thereof is that he actually thinks that the best thing for the United States to do is to take a back seat, kind of observe things, and let the other parties take the lead in this. But that's not what the world is looking for. The world is still looking for, like it or not. For us here in the United States, like it or not, we have become the world leader, and the rest of the world looks at us to take the lead on matters such as this. And this is a president that does not want to have anything to do whatsoever with let's face it, with a leadership role in his own country, let alone in the world.
Well, no, and that's something, that scares me too. I think the last time that the world was starting to fall apart, and correct me if I'm wrong, and we kind of chose at first to stay out of it and only provide advisory roles and everything, is going into World War II. We made that choice at the beginning to kind of let Europe deal with it and kind of stay out of the way, and then some other thing happens. We even went to the point that we had the Flying Tigers essentially resign their commissions in order to not be part of the American air military as they were defending China. So, and it almost, it eventually backfired. We get drawn into these things almost against our will sometime, because that's another time that we were trying to take that step back and not be that person in charge, and it ended up biting us, if you will. So,
Oh, it's right. It even goes back further than that to World War One. Stop and think about what it took for us to get drawn into World War One. We were actually, people don't understand that the United States was actually involved in World War One in the latter stages of the war, and then after World War One, we kind of took a seat back to another, to a isolationist type mentality, and that led up to World War Two, and we saw how that almost came back to bite us in the butt, like what you were just talking about. And this president has definitely, he is certainly taking a Woodrow Wilson mentality when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, which, there's a lot of analogies and similarities that we can make between this president and Woodrow Wilson. He's talking about, putting 300 military advisors on the ground. For everyone who can't speak his lingo, that's special operators, military force, for training and advisory, as they say. Also, he's going to work with Congress to secure some equipment. The last time we did that, ISIL is now driving around in our equipment. So I don't know if that's necessarily the best answer going there. He's got U.S. assets in the region. Obviously, the aircraft carrier group, George H.W. Bush, is in the Persian Gulf. We are flying F-18 for surveillance right now over the region. He's talking about airstrikes. I just don't know how it's he alluded to airstrikes, I should say. I don't know how he's going to be able to do that without collateral damage, but you can guess those 300 military advisors would be the ones who are leading that up. And then he gets to the point of Iraq having to take the lead. And I think it's funny that, he blamed Iraq essentially for our withdrawal a few years ago when he was the one that put everything in motion to have that earlier withdrawal plan and get us out. Am I wrong on that? Did that not happen?
That's exactly what he did, and he even, in the questioning, and I'll be honest, a lot of the questioning that he took, they seem to be a lot of softball questions, and they definitely were, because you did not see him call on anybody that would definitely ask him a tough question, but from the questioning, he definitely was blaming this on the government of Iraq, and he was definitely alluding to when he was saying, we've seen what has happened, when we jump into actions like this, under an underlying message, he's, using the same old blame Bush mentality that he's done. Once again, this is not my fault. I have nothing to do with this. The best solution, we can argue if we should have stayed in Iraq, if we should have pulled out, if we need to stay in Afghanistan, if we need to pull out. But in all honesty, the best plan that should have been in line to begin with is we should have maintained a military base in Iraq just for anything, for stability in the Middle East. And, you
just
saw
to have
that what we,
there,
go ahead, Sean.
Just to have that presence there may have changed a lot of things. And, we've talked on the show and we've said, listen, if you're going to pull everyone home, then you pull everyone home and call it a day, but don't pick and choose.
Exactly.
And right now he's picking and choosing. Look at the last time he threw aircraft carriers or warships in the Gulf or off the Middle East. He drew a red line, and he never, ever, ever acted on that. A lot of there are people out there who are thinking that he is hoping to get drawn into some sort of military conflict in order to change from all the other things going on right now in the administration with the IRS thing, Benghazi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see him ever saying, hey, let's make that call and let's drop some cruise missiles in Iraq and straighten these people out?
Well, here's a little bit different situation, and I'm going to use this with Bill Clinton, who infamously ordered targeted attacks on pill factories and really non-essential military targets. And a lot of people said he ordered those attacks to kind of cover up the fact that, Monica Lewinsky couldn't get a stain out of her dress. So now we come to this situation. When we come to this situation, what we have here, you have a situation in the Middle East that these folks have been fighting for thousands of years, okay? And we'll say thousands. Let's say going back back a couple of thousand years. They have a tribal mentality, and you especially see that in Afghanistan. So this particular organization that is marching towards Baghdad right now, a lot of people don't understand that they're also have a big role that they're playing in Syria. So let's think about this. Exactly. So stop and think about what happens to the Middle East if these radical Islamic terrorists, by the way, who all of a sudden, they were being touted as an offshoot of Al Qaeda, but at this point, I would say that Al Qaeda is probably an offshoot of them because of how powerful they've become. But
Al Qaeda has called them.
Oh, go ahead, John.
Al Qaeda has called them too extreme. Believe it or not, there are members of Al Qaeda leadership that have called ISIL too extreme.
Exactly. So stop and think, how they've been able to, obtain, almost $500 billion in assets, all of the military assets they've been able to obtain, whether they were leftover Russian or American assets that they have gotten from the Iraqi military. And a lot of those assets they have started transferring, and not only are they using in Iraq, they're transferring them over to Syria so that they're better equipped to go up against Assad's troops there. So stop and think about it. If they're able to capture Syria, if they're able to capture Iraq, this is an absolute nightmare in the making. And the problem with this guy, with President Obama, he has no targets, let's say non-essential military targets that he can target here, just to say that I'm doing something. In this case, he would actually have to be, putting American troops, American pilots in harm's way, and engaging against legitimate military targets that will be shooting back. Okay, and so, by the way, that we've helped equip these guys. We have helped equip and given weapons to the Syrian rebels. And so, so in this case, if he gives the order to start bombing, it will be against legitimate military targets. And I don't personally think that is something that this president wants to have anything to do with him, just because it looks bad politically to him. And then, of course, that immediately thrusts the United States back into a leadership role. And listening to President Obama's remarks today, you would swear that he is just sitting back and hoping that the Iranians. Let's think about the disaster that would be if the Iranians actually take the lead on this.
We talked last night. The enemy of the enemy is my friend. Sort of, and it's almost that Stockholm syndrome, and I don't necessarily feel that that's the case. And I'll tell you who I'm watching right now. I'm watching Israel, and I'm watching the Turks. Both NATO countries, both have a national security interest right in there. And if one of those two countries' hands are forced, and listen, there's reports now that ISIL has Stinger missiles that they've captured from the Iraqi army, the amount of equipment they have. If Israel or Turkey turns around and says, hey, you know what, these guys are starting to become a threat to us, we have to take action. NATO countries, and if they invoke, I believe it's Article 37 of NATO,
exactly,
we would have to go whether we want to or not. So is it a better thing to start getting, and I know he talked about, being a U.S. to lead all the area countries in a diplomatic means, but I would start to venture that the entire Middle East, and I'm talking Syria, I'm talking Iran, I'm talking Iraq, rather, specifically. But if those two countries absolutely lose it, and as much as, I despise the Syrian government, if they lose total control, Iraq loses total control, you now have this huge vacuum that they, he's talking about ISIL filling, and I'm worried that it's going to be elsewhere. I'm worried that the Russians are going to fill it. I'm worried that the Iranians are going to try to fill it. And then we have a much bigger problem because Iran, if they have the ability, and I said last night, I wouldn't be shocked if you wouldn't find some Russian money in ISIL, and even maybe some Syrian money. Because as much as people want to believe that there are these religious ideologues, A lot of them are, but also a lot of them are just purely financial driven. And it would not shock me to find some Russian or Syrian money behind them in the Iraq movement to destabilize Iraq and give Iran a bigger foothold with oil.
Oh, yeah, you're definitely that's exactly right. Because let's stop and think what is funding the Iranian nuclear program. It is their oil money. So if they were to be able to get a hold of the oil fields in Iraq, I mean, by the way, Iraq's largest oil field is now controlled by these radical Islamists.
Yes.
So what's to stop the Iranians all of a sudden from starting to back these guys to get complete control of that? And Iran has long wanted to get control of that. And they get control of those oil fields, that makes them even more dangerous, not only as far as, driving up energy prices, but them being able to produce nuclear weapons. And then if they start producing nuclear weapons, they would be more than happy to turn around and sell those weapons to other countries, be happy to sell those to willing terrorists, and so then we've got a bigger problem on our hands. And the Obama administration, and you hear this in his remarks, when you sit here and listen to him, you have to wonder, certainly, he's a well-educated individual, but is he being coy, or does he really not have a clue about the history of the Middle East and what is actually taking place? He was talking about, how we need to help the Iraqi government to have better intelligence as to what's taking place on the battlefield and stuff like that. Has he not turned off? We heard that President Obama often learns about stuff from CNN or from MSNBC.
He finds out about it when we do.
Has he not turned one of those on yet to see what's happening? That these guys are less than 30 miles from Baghdad on 3 flanks, fixing to come in, and the Iraqi forces are just dropping their weapons because they're scared of being assassinated and beheaded and having their head played with like a soccer ball that they're putting
and
that
families being
videos
attacked
of.
and murdered.
Exactly.
Well,
having to dig their own graves and then be executed. These radical terrorists that are fighting the Iraqi forces, they are not taking prisoners. They are executing these folks as they come along. This president is, either he's being coy because he doesn't want to take the leadership role, doesn't want to really have anything to do with this, or he is absolutely clueless in. I have to say it's actually a combination of both. He doesn't want to have to mess with this because he doesn't have a clue.
Well, yeah, I think what he thinks he knows isn't even close, and then he's ignorant to a lot of the stuff he wants to know. And I think that's something that we need to he needs to be educated on. One of the things I tell people in this country too, whether you think we should or should not put boots on the ground in Iraq, a lot of these Iraqi soldiers are to their country are the same as if it was our Marines and our soldiers who were being slaughtered by terrorist groups and our reaction. And, that's something to keep in mind. It really doesn't matter how you look at the Iraq war or everything. Just understand that these folks, for the majority that sign up to protect their country, and they know groups like ISIL, they know them much better than we do. They know that all these splinter groups are coming in and they're going to try to attack. And a lot of them are still signing up for the right reasons. And they're being slaughtered by the masses in a situation that some could argue we have responsibility in still, and our stake responsibility. So I think that if you look at it from that point of view, it makes this much more complicated.
Oh, you're right, and that goes back to the issue of, and you and I were discussing this earlier. Now, should we have left a military base in Iraq to provide the stability that is needed in that region? We saw, we had little attacks here and there, but for the most part, we go back to Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, for being the murderous, bloody dictator that he was, he did provide stability to the region until we took him out. Should we have taken him out? Well, yes, we should have. But when we made that decision to take Saddam Hussein out, who was, despite all of his all the murderous things that he did provide stability to the region. It now became our responsibility to provide that stability for the region until the Iraqi government and the Iraqi people, military, could do that for themselves. So now we fast forward, we started pulling out 2011. We fast forward to where we are today. We see that these folks are nowhere near prepared to provide the stability in their own country that is needed. We're looking at Iraq possibly being split into three different countries. And would that be a good idea? That's yet to be seen. But it certainly would. You're looking at a situation where even if Iraq was split into three different countries, they're still going to be warring with each other, and it would still increase. And we're going to see the exact same thing. We announce our timetable. We're leaving by this date. So we saw in Iraq what happened. They just bided their time. They just waited us out, and now we see the massive wave. The same thing is going to happen in Afghanistan. We had no plan in place whatsoever to make sure that the stability was in place when we left, and and we certainly don't have a president right now that wants to go back and try to help provide that stability.
And I only get about 30 seconds left, Dan, because I have to prep for my show that's coming up at I'm going to have to push it back to 1 today. Your closing thoughts on his speech today and what we should do?
Well, in all honesty, I thought it was I thought he was just standing up there. He was just, trying to save face. It was just another piecemeal. It's the same thing that we keep hearing Barack Obama repeat over and over and over again. He does not want to take a leadership role in the world. He does not want the United States to be a leader in the world. And we see the disastrous foreign policy that because of this president, that the Middle East now is fixing to explode and burst into flames, and it's gonna take we have all the work that we put into has been undone in just a matter of days and weeks as we watch Iraq fall into just oblivion.
Well, Dan, thank you. Yeah, it's going to be horrible. To think of all the American lives that were spent and injured over there, to try to give that country hope and a chance to be free, and to have all this undone in such a short amount of time, with really little more than eye batting and finger pointing on my behalf. It's going to be tough to watch how this plays out, and hopefully, like I said, hopefully a coalition either led by us or not. At this point, and this is strictly for the people of Iraq, the ones that are there that are actually decent people. Hopefully somebody steps up and tries to give them a little bit more help than 300 military advisors. I'm not advocating for us to necessarily go back in, but if he wants this whole isolationist thing, fine, let's get behind that if you want. And let's get some other people in there who are going to be leaders, because I can tell you right now, I'm sure Israel's chomping at the bit to try to get some boots on the ground in there to try to stabilize all that stuff for their lives.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, Sean. At this point, I personally think that with what has happened with Syria, what has happened and what's taking place in Iraq right now, I think the situation is too far gone to be stabilized without let's face it, without another major military operation to come in and take out these radical Islamists and get the stability back. Because I just don't think that the Iraqi military on its own can repel these guys. And I think it's just a matter of days now before the battle for Baghdad begins, and without a full-scale military operation, we can't have a piecemeal deal. There's no way to have pieces and parts, a strategic military strike, stuff like that. I just don't see, unless we were just to conduct a full-scale military operation again, that we can overcome all the damage that's been done.
Well, Yeah, only time's going to tell. We'll see in the coming days. Dan Butcher from Pundit Press, sir, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sean. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, sir. And check out all the good people over at Pundit Press. Wonderful folks, wonderful friends. If you haven't checked them out yet, you're doing yourself a disservice. Thank you all who joined us for this special edition of SHR Media News. We covered the president's speech on the escalating violence in Iraq. Coming up at 12:30 on the East Coast, 3:30 on the swap that 12:30 on the West Coast, 3:30 on the East Coast. I will have my mannerism show this afternoon. We'll discuss a whole bunch of cool stuff on that. I can't wait to do that. 4 p.m. this afternoon is the Evan Miller Report here on shrmedia.com, and coming up at 6 p.m. on the Pacific, 9 on the East, you're going to have the Exceptional Conservative Show hosted by the exceptional one himself, Ken McClinton. This has been a production of the SHR Media News Network. We now return you back to your regularly scheduled program.